She directs the Emory Digital Humanities Lab and the Atlanta Interdisciplinary AI Network. Klein's research brings together computational and critical methods in order to explore questions of gender, race, and justice. She is an author with Catherine DeGanazio of the award-winning Data Feminism and editor of Debates in the Digital Humanities, among other publications. She's currently completing Data by Design, an interactive history of data visualization, forthcoming from the MIT Press, and the subject of her talk here at Outlier. Tanvi is a design technologist operating at the intersection of data, aesthetics, and the humanities. Previously, she has worked with Pentagram, Spotify, Public Policy Lab, and BIPOC Design History. Please give them a warm welcome, and we'll kick off our presentations today.
Hi, everyone. It's so amazing to be here. I just have to say, as someone who really sort of taught myself everything that I know about data visualization, to be asked to give this keynote is it's so meaningful to me. It's so amazing to be welcomed into this community. So thank you for having me here. Thank you for having us here. And thank you for listening. I am going to give Tanvi a chance to introduce yourself in 1 second, but I just want to tell you what you're looking at right here before we get into it. We're going to be talking about this project. You've already heard about it, but now you're looking at it. It's called Data by Design, and what it does is tell the story of the emergence of modern data visualization using visualization itself. That's why we're calling it an interactive history, and it's going to be officially published by the MIT Press in 2026. Oh, we have a clicker. Nice. Here, your turn.
Hi, this is Tanvi. I'm here too. I'm the lead designer on this project. I've also worked as a design engineer, as mentioned, at Pentagram, Spotify, Public Policy Lab, and I'm really happy to be here. I've been on this project for five years now, and yeah, I'm excited to see what y'all have to say about it and think about it. Thank you. All right, back to Lauren.
Can I grab it? Yes. Sorry. Okay, thank you. So what we're going to do today is just introduce the overall frame for the project, and then we're going to hone in on the two examples that you've already heard about that are in the title of the talk, the line graph and the slave ship. And what we're going to do is walk through a somewhat detailed analysis of those two charts to give you a sense of the kind of material that shows up in the project, and then we're going to talk a little bit about our own design process. And hopefully all of this together will take us back to our overall goal, which is both the one of the project, and I think really echoes some of the themes of this conference. And it's showing how an expanded understanding of the history of data visualization can help shape its future, and more specifically can shape a future that is informed by more ethics, more intention, and more care. So we're just going to get into it. So at this point, 2025, we can all mostly agree that data is a tremendous form of power. And we know this from many, many scholars and practitioners. You could think of Sophia Noble, Max Lieberman, Ruha Benjamin, Kathy O'Neill. The list could go on and on and on. But where this project intervenes is to say that visualization is also a tremendous form of power. And when we think about visualization, we tend to think of its purpose as communicating the meaning of the data underneath. So you could think of Edward Tufte, the man everyone loves to hate, but he tells us that the purpose of visualization is to, quote, reveal the meaning of data. Or you could look to the academic research, someone like Ben Schneiderman, saying that visualization is something like a telescope or a microscope. It's a tool to amplify what we could already maybe or sort of or maybe not even yet see with our eyes. And all of this may be true, but our entry point is to say that visualization doesn't only help make meaning of data, but the very act of visualizing data, this act makes meaning in and of itself. And this observation, in turn, prompts more questions. So who are the people who are making these design decisions? Which people are they designing for? For what purposes? And then for what ultimate goals? And in the book, we make the case that all of these questions, these are questions of power. And so the next question is like, okay, so like, why should we care? Well, once we see these questions as questions of power, we can start to make our own ethical and intentional decisions about visualization. And I mean this both from the perspective of viewers and interpreting them, but also from the perspective of design. And so just very briefly, here you see a recent Financial Times visualization that uses an increasingly saturated palette of oranges and reds to convey the intensity of global warming. A visualization of unemployment claims from only 3 weeks into the COVID pandemic that intentionally does not normalize the scale of the x-axis in order to emphasize the orders of magnitude number of larger unemployment claims that were taking place that week. And then finally, you have an emphatically unethical but definitely intentional visualization created by our president in 2019, which he made by taking the official cone of uncertainty from NOAA and redirecting it from Florida to Alabama using a Sharpie. And I don't know where, Alberto, he has lots of opinions about this, so you should ask him about this later. So these are all contemporary examples, but data visualization is much older than you might think. So here are just a few of the most famous examples of early visualization. So from oldest to newest, you have clay tablets from Mesopotamia that use a form of not even cuneiform, but proto-cuneiform to record information about the distribution of grain. You have on the left, Incan quipu, which, as you know, relied upon the system of knots and strings to track people, land, and resources. And in the middle, you have an example of Chinese counting rods. These are from Hunan province, and these enabled groupings of numbers to assist in complex or abstract math. Here's just one more historical example of what's called a Nilometer, which was used to monitor the depth of the Nile, and on that basis, how to decide how to prepare for potential floods. This one is from Cairo in Egypt. It dates to 1861. And what I like about this example is that it very clearly shows how visualization has always been about power. So it was constructed in a temple. Only priests and kings could access it. And so when they appeared to have divine knowledge about future flooding, it further reinforced their own power over the people they were ruling over. So in our project, we focus on the 19th century, both because it's the period of time that's often cited when people talk about the emergence of so-called modern data visualization, and we can explain those air quotes later if you'd like. Also, it happens to be a period of time that I know a lot about, so little known fact about me, I have a PhD in American literature, which I got after burning out of software development after the first dot-com boom. So that's like sort of another reason why we look at this time period. But in any case, if you go looking to historical examples from this time period, you can actually find a lot of examples that resemble visualization forms that we still have today. So you see here one of the first time series charts, which dates to 1786. You see what's believed to be the first ever pie chart, which dates to 1801. And then on the right, you have this like sparkline area chart hybrid that dates to 1806. And all of these were created by someone you may have heard of, a Scottish political economist named William Playfair. And we'll talk more about him in a minute. But the point that I want to make now is that we tend not to think about these charts as involving questions of power, right? We just think like, cool, a 19th century pie chart, you know, like, or like if you are me and you respond like this to cool historical images. But I should also say there are actually a lot of charts from this era that are like just wild. So you see on the right, an early 19th century chart made by the educational innovator and women's rights activist Emma Willard from a project called The Picture of Nations. In the middle is a sort of thematic map made by someone named Shauna Dithit. She was a Beothic woman who lived in Newfoundland at the start of the 19th century. And then on the other side, you have a chart that visualizes significant events from the perspective of the United States, created by another educator, Elizabeth Palmer Peabody. And we'll have a little bit more to say about her as well. But for now, what I want to do is go back to Playfair. So this is his import-export chart that shows the balance of trade between England and North America in the years between 1700 and 1800. And this was an updated version. It was the last year for which he had data when he made this version around 1801. And it's funny, it's like I've been studying this chart for a long time, but now that we once again are thinking about tariffs, I feel like this chart has additional significance. But I like to start with this chart because Playfair's ideas about data visualization are very clearly aligned with what we generally understand the purpose of data visualization to be in the present. So here's some of his own writing on this subject, and this appears in the preface to the book. He says, "When inspecting one of these charts attentively, a distinct impression will be made, and the idea which does remain will be simple and complete." So hopefully what you can see here is not only a strong visual antecedent of what data visualizations look like today, but also and I'm going to use like an academic word here, but I think it's valuable, an epistemological rationale. So this is epistemology meaning like a theory of how knowledge is produced. So in sort of more sort of like straightforward language, how data visualization works, like how it's supposed to produce new knowledge, according to Playfair, is by making this distinct impression on the senses, on the eyes, so that the idea that sort of remains in the mind's eye will be what he describes as simple and complete. And this is a little bit of an aside, but I love these charts so much, and I had to shoehorn them into this talk somehow. But just to underscore this point about how specific theories of how knowledge is made end up influencing design decisions. So here are these two charts, now you can see them in large, created by Elizabeth Palmer Peabody. And Peabody's goal here, and she also states it explicitly, was to, quote, leave a little room for abstraction. So she wanted her viewers to stop and reflect. And so you can compare this to Playfair's immediate impression, right? So this is a very different way of thinking about how knowledge is made. And then sort of a secondary question is like, well, who are the viewers for whom she wanted to create this knowledge? Why was she doing this? So Peabody was essentially designing her charts for what were in effect middle school students. So this was the 1850s, and it was pretty clear that the United States was heading towards civil war. And Peabody saw that her own generation, the adults, had failed to engineer a solution to national wholeness. But she thought that if she encouraged her students to create their own interpretation of the past, they might be able to envision a wide range of possible futures, some that hadn't been overdetermined by how the past had been narrated to them. And I think another thing that's helpful to us in the present is like, because these charts look so strange, or not necessarily strange, they sort of look like a Mondrian painting, but they don't really look like data visualization. But because they don't look like what we expect a viz to do or be, we're naturally prompted to ask, like, what on earth Peabody was thinking when she designed them. But by contrast, the ubiquity of time series charts or line graphs today, we're far less likely to ask what Playfair was thinking when he designed his time series chart, right? But like Peabody, he also had a very specific viewership in mind. And also like Peabody, he tells us exactly who they are. So this is more Playfair. This is him explaining how he's designed his charts for, quote, men of high rank or active business. He says these men, quote, can only pay attention to general outlines, nor is attention to particulars of any use. So I want to take a beat here because when we look at a time series chart today, we're usually not thinking that it has a politics, right? And we might even go so far as to say that line graphs are among the most neutral and objective possible forms of visualizing data that we possess in our toolkit. And to be very honest with you, until reading Playfair, I did too. I was like, oh yeah, like that's why you can't argue with that. It's just points on a line, right? But this is a political statement, right? But the other point that I want to underscore here is that it's also a theory about how knowledge is made. And I think it's worth reflecting on because it points to another key takeaway for us as designers. And this has to do with what I have come to see as a fundamental contradiction at the heart of data visualization. And the contradiction is as follows. So the power of data visualization, and now I'm not talking like political power or power of influence, but the very basic sort of knowledge-producing power of visualization, sort of the thing that derives from its ability to prompt insight easily and efficiently and all of these things. This power fundamentally, but also necessarily, comes at the expense of context and detail, right? Like, so it's never not a trade-off. So what do we do about this? Sort of how do we move forward with our design practice with this trade-off top of mind? And so it's here in the project that we looked for guidance from another historical example that was actually interestingly created within only a single year of Playfair's original chart, but it's sort of not as much considered as this foundational image in the story we tell ourselves about data visualization's rise. It's called Plan of an African Ship. And what it shows is the configuration of captive bodies on a slaving voyage, and it underscores the profound humanity or lack of humanity that was expressed during the middle passage. And I'm intentionally introducing it before I show it to you because it's an upsetting one, but I wanted to give you a little bit of lead time. I'm going to show it to you now. And what we've been thinking about in the project about this chart in the context of visualization is that, unlike in Playfair's charts, here you see both halves of that contradiction of visualization. So you see both the abstraction that enables this image to become such a powerful encapsulation of the horrors of the slave trade. And yet, with all of the individual bodies, you also get a reminder of the actual lives that the data represent. And because Playfair's chart was designed for people who he thought didn't have time to concern themselves with the particulars, he allows his viewers to ignore the actual lives behind the data. But on the flip side, because Plan of an African Ship was intentionally designed to evoke sympathy and therefore political change, it also intentionally does not. But the thing is, when you stop to think about it, like, what were the actual sources of profit and trade between England and America in the 18th century? Like, these were also people, right?
Yeah, the imports and exports are also people.
Yeah.
Same year.
But that we don't get that really sobering reality that's conveyed through those clean data lines that Playfair shows on his chart. So this leads us to another question. So how do we use this newfound awareness of power and these contradictions between detail and abstraction in order to make more ethical and intentional decisions going forward? And this is where we're going to turn to one of our own visualizations from the project, where we attempted to work our way through this sort of conundrum. So this is actually the third and the final part of the talk. I'm about to pass it over to Tanvi, but I'll just tell you a little bit about the data that we used for this portion of the project. The data comes from something called the Voyages data set. It's online, it's open access, you can visit it yourself. It includes records of 36,000 individual slaving voyages, which have been meticulously compiled by historians of slavery over a 40-year span. So the actual process of creating this data set is pretty fascinating as well. But when visualizing this data, we began by asking ourselves some of the same questions that you saw posed up on the screen. So what would it mean to visualize this data while holding both halves of this contradiction of data visualization in our hands at the same time? So this power of abstraction, and also the reminder that there are always people behind the data that are being visualized, who may or may not be able to be surfaced through that process. Okay, over to Tanvi.
As from history nerd to design nerd. We're talking about the transatlantic slave trade. And one of the, I think, most notable features is just how long it was. And so we chose to focus on our representation of time. A frequent observation made about the experience of the Middle Passage is like the captives did not experience time as linear while in the hold of the ship. They were like most likely like under the like they couldn't see the sun sometimes, and also like it's water all around. You have no perception of time. So that said, our original design drew visual inspiration from Harold Fisk's alluvial diagram of the Mississippi River, which is what you see on the right. We thought a stream diagram might be a good equivalence because it allows us to use the bends and turns to represent that kind of nonlinearity of the middle passage. But very depressingly, when we went from the visual prototype to the actual data and plugging it in, there were far too many voyages, 36,000 voyages, to achieve any kind of like visual separation. So we turned to a more contemporary reference point for highly abstract but dimensional data, which was Martin Wattenberg and Fernando Vegas's wind map. And taking that, we plotted our 36,000 voyages as, as these like vanishing traces against this deep blue background. And we were left with this visualization of a sea in motion. And you see these like yellow North stars here that indicate the voyages that were associated with an act of resistance. But this like almost like reminiscent of a Van Gogh painting kind of a visual representation was just kind of too beautiful, too hopeful to be associated with what the data set is about. Like, it's been called a living death. So we turned back to the Fisk diagram. And so here, we kind of flipped the script. Instead of visualizing all the voyages first, we only visualized the resistance voyages, which is like 2% of the overall data set. So for each voyage, we create this visual encoding called a bind. And we use alternating colors to allow for visual separation between each of the voyages. So these are voyages that are taking place in the same year. And from the top, it's like the width of each line or each bind kind of denotes how many people are on board. So it begins with a lot of people departing from Africa, and then it kind of like decreases in width as we're arriving to the Americas and the less amount of people have survived. The duration of each voyage is conveyed through the length, and so the amplitude increases and decreases as the voyages get longer. And then we clustered all these voyages with the same years together and like arranged them linearly and put white space between each year, so there's some separation. And in our visualization, the binds are arranged chronologically. So from the first act of recording resistance aboard, that's like in 1565, to the last in 1865. But we're still thinking about like, hey, what does this not convey? There's something missing. And maybe we might never be able to convey no matter how much we try. So going back to our data set, there's this variable of resistance, and this is how it's like quantified in the actual data set. But we're thinking about like, okay, but what else is resistance? There's like more quiet forms of resistance that are not captured in this data set. Like, what about refusing to eat? Refusing to answer your captor's commands? Like, these are also real acts of resistance and also meaningful, but not represented in our data. And in truth, they remain difficult to represent as data. So in our final set of visualizations, we bring in the additional 35,000 voyages, and we plot them first in outline only. Whoop, okay. Can't play that. We'll show you the video in a sec. But we first plot them in outline only and then gradually add a color fill. So that, in a sense, implies that all of these voyages, regardless of what the data set says, contain an act of resistance. And in many ways, the act of surviving itself is resistance. Oh, there we go. Ta-da. There's a lot more related to the design of this whiz and the design of the other chapters that I've left out, so I encourage you to go to the website, explore it in depth, ask questions, and also sign up for our mailing list so we can let you know when we have made more progress and there's a final version of the website ready to be released. But, final thing. We mentioned at the beginning of this talk that our goal is to arrive at some overall takeaways. So here's some strategies that we've surfaced through process. And the strategies being ask for who and by whom any visualization has been designed, probe any missing data and the reasons why, and hold space for the possibility of not visualizing at all. And some of these are weighty. It's because visualization of data is a powerful thing, as we've seen today. But it's precisely because of this power that we must continue to question the nature of the insights that visualization can prompt. Also, think about the additional insights that visualization can not prompt and never convey. That's it. That's all. Thank you for listening. These are all the members of our team and ways you can get in contact with us. You can also visit the Data by Design website, dataxdesign.io, and scroll to the bottom for newsletter updates. Thank you. Are we doing questions?
I think so, yeah. We're even on time.
We are
Go
on
us.
time.
Yay.
Questions? Nice.
Is this okay? Yeah. So we have a virtual question from Pay In. They ask, will the chat feature be open on the virtual platform for virtual attendees to chat with one another?
Yeah, there's the Q&A part of the virtual app is open for people to ask questions. I can help assist that. Here you go. Sorry.
It was intriguing to hear the idea that this import-exports includes slave trade. Is there the possibility to recreate that visual with that information broken out somehow? Do we have enough information?
Okay, now it's working. That's an amazing idea. And I will say that like one of the interesting things, so in the project we have a chapter about the Plan of an African Ship, and we also have a chapter about Playfair. And while we found the data that we were working with, the Voyages data, to be really resonant and have a lot of possibilities for design, we really struggled with the Playfair data because it seems so flat. And so I actually am going to like file that away and get your name, because if we do that, we will totally credit you. But one of the really interesting things, I've been sort of reflecting on why it's been so hard to do anything with Playfair's data. And part of that, well, there's a couple of reasons. One, and the largest one, is that Playfair himself didn't really care about data. And in a lot of his writing, he talks about how visualization sort of does a different thing than data. He's like, you learn certain things from data and you learn certain things from viz. And he really didn't see them as connected. And in fact, he didn't even want to include the sources of his data in the first volumes of his charts until Ian Watt, the steam engine inventor guy who Playfair had like interned for, told him like, you should probably include your data sources, because otherwise people aren't going to trust what they're seeing. And he did that in the first versions of the book, but by the third edition, when he had generated his own fan base, he didn't include them anymore. And interestingly, we're not the only people who have rehashed Playfair, and some people have done really deep dives into his data sources and discovered that there's tons of discrepancies. He did compile some of the data from published annual account books from the sort of local, like revenue commissioner kind of thing. But when it sort of didn't really show what he wanted to show, he took a lot of liberties. And again, I don't say this to fault him, but I think it's actually really interesting to think about how, when we think about what our charge is today, we really, if we were to show something that is not pictured in a data set, that would be like lying. That would be lying with charts, right? And yet Playfair was really convinced that what you could see with your eyes, what this big picture view entailed, was so different from what you could derive by poring over data tables and line-by-line increases and decreases, that he wasn't bothered by it. He didn't see that as a contradiction in his thought process or his design process either.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions in the room?
Thank you. It was a great talk. There was a slide near the end that mentioned one of the tactics one can use is maybe not visualizing at all. Hold space for the possibility of not visualizing at all, which totally makes sense. I agree with. But with this premise that visualizing is power, if other people aren't taking these same ethical considerations into account and are furthering entrenched agendas of power and putting out, you know, their own views and visions, and there's no counter to that, isn't there also an imperative to try to, you know, not cede the ground of whatever the visual debate might be? I feel like there's a contradiction there too that I'm interested in hearing you guys respond to.
Yeah, maybe I'll talk about it a little, and then I'll pass to Tanvi to hear from her as well. So this is another really interesting question. So I'll say sort of anecdotally, so I wrote this other book called Data Feminism, where we make some of these points more generally with respect to data visualization. And the angriest feedback I've ever gotten has been from a presentation that I gave at the CDC to epidemiologists. And they were like, how dare you say that we introduce nuance and complexity and incorporate emotion, because we work so hard to communicate the basic facts to an unwilling public audience that we have no time for all of your it's complicated and think hard about things. Like, we don't want to hear it. And so I think that's sort of to your point, right, is that sometimes the urgency, the political or the social urgency, requires that we communicate things clearly and simply and sort of in the style of Playfair, right? Being like, people, like most people aren't gonna dig into the data. They're not gonna pause and reflect. We just need to show them the very basic takeaway, because that might be the only thing they ever see, right? But there are other times, and there are other audiences who might either need or want a different kind of framing. And so my sort of broader takeaway from this is that everything is always contextual. And we can go through this whole process and come to the conclusion that what we need is a time series chart, right? Because that is the clearest way to communicate what is important about the data to that particular audience. But the problem is when you don't reflect on what might happen if you made another choice, or what might happen if you surface historical trauma associated with the data, or what a particular slice of your viewership might experience in relation to, you know, the rest of the viewership. If you don't think all of those decisions through before, then you might end up inadvertently causing harm, communicating something you didn't intend, or anything else. And so I mean, this is mostly just a call to like think really, and all of us in this room do this already. You know, like in many ways, you guys are not the audience for this project. But like it's just sort of a call to like make sure that you're making the right decision. And I often tell myself, like for me, the litmus test is like, if I'm on a stage and someone says, why did you make that design choice? I want to be able to answer confidently, pointing to the reasons why I made the decisions that I did.
Yeah, I'll just hop off on what you were talking about, that, and to your question, like I think there is also a space between not visualizing and visualizing, which is like visualizing slowly. So where can we have an opportunity for like progressive disclosure? Like we're showing you a visualization that is impactful, can be like restaging trauma and just upsetting. So what is the context we give you before we show you that? Do we give you just a moment to like, all right, we're good to go? Or more information, more layers, more interactivity? Like, what does that look like? Yeah. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. There are a couple of questions online. So the first one is, what was the most unexpected part of your design journey? From Tylin. Thank you, Tylin, for the question.
Oh. Maybe this is like kind of like a noob answer, but I think for me the most unexpected is that how bad I was like 6 months ago. Like I always look at my design decisions and I'm like, oh, need to redo that one. Let's make that again. And so for me it's like I'm always learning. I think people are always interpreting things in ways that are not expected. And there's always a fancy new technology to like make my pixels look even brighter. And yeah, I think for me it's that the hardest part is being okay with it, like calling it done and not revising and just doing it again.
Oh, see, this is funny because my answer to this was to say the most surprising thing I learned is how amazing it is to work with an actual trained designer. I mean, this had been a really an academic project, so I was working with mostly grad students in HCI who are really good at interfaces and wireframing and things like this. But it wasn't until Tanvi joined the project that I was like, oh, this is really what you can do with visualization.
And also, there's no material design library for this stuff. You really have to take the concept, think about what you're trying to do, and maybe invent new ways of doing the thing on the web. So I think that's the most challenging and also exciting part.
Great. Thank you so much.
Do we have time for maybe a couple more? If anybody's got some burning. Oh, I see you. I see you too. Now fight.
Perfect. Yeah, it's here. Let me give you, and then we'll answer one more question online.
Okie dokes. Thank you. You win.
I didn't mean to win. They had their hand up first. I hope you get your turn.
I'm sorry.
Hi, thank you for the great opening talk, and I love all the kind of focus on being more responsible with how we visualize data. I perhaps want to raise the elephant in the room question of, in a world where people are more and more using AI-type tools to create data visualizations, how is it that we can help to evangelize these kind of principles to people who may not be in our communities? Or if people in this room are using AI-type tools, how do you bring these kind of pieces into what often ends up being build the quick, simple, pithy chart or the kind of overly stylized mid-journey graphic type chart, both of which fall, I think, less into that slow data visualization approach that you were talking about, Tanvi. Thank you.
We have now entered our segment of Ask the AI Ethicist.
Oh, no. I was hoping you would have an answer for this. I mean, I think, it is the elephant in the room because right now, all of the possible solutions seem pretty incommensurate with how AI is being sort of forced upon all areas of our lives. And so, the basic questions where it's well, we need AI literacy, or we can just do a good job and people will see the difference. Those things don't matter because they're not powerful enough to push back against the people who are making decisions about whether or not we get to use AI. I'm glad to hear there's someone from the New York Times because I feel like this is this is happening everywhere where people who are in positions of power over us are telling us hey, how about you use AI now? I've heard it's really good. And it's really hard to be a person who says no, in this particular day and age. And I think more than that, where up until recently, refusal seemed to be it could be a viable path. And I do think it still is for certain people who are sort of protected enough to be able to make their own decisions and not get fired. But for most of us, we have to use the tools that are given to us. Otherwise, we don't have our jobs anymore because they'll find someone who will. So that's a little bit of a depressing ramble, but I think I don't have a great answer except to say, on the one hand, keep doing our work. Some people will see it, and maybe the audience gets smaller, but it still matters. But the other thing that I think is really important, I've been thinking about this a lot, is that all of these underlying theories are really important for us to understand, because if what is required is structural change or reconfigurations of power or workplaces, we need to learn from the past and past examples where that was successful so that we can envision an alternative. I think one of the most depressing things about the present moment is we haven't been given space to imagine other ways that we could use AI in a way that would benefit our work. It's just in this sort of faster, cheaper, fewer people, reduction of quality kind of mindset. I don't know if you have thoughts.
No, yeah, definitely, because also ultimately, those past colonial examples are what our AI data sets are trained on. So what they're spitting out, what is it? We must know.
We have, so due to the limit of time, we're gonna have one more online question answer, but we have more coming in, so you guys can answer afterwards. Nothing will be missed, so don't worry. But this one is from Alex, and it's kind of two questions in one. They say, I appreciate the storytelling in your work. And question number one is, what is the process of editing the story that you're going to tell? Question number two is, how do you know there are no blind spots or missing perspective in your work?
Second question first. Sometimes we don't know. I think one of the things that we've done with the project is we opened it up to community review, and we got tons of comments, and maybe more, hopefully after this, pointing out some of the blind spots and be like, hey, have you seen this other cool thing? Or like, how about you approach this other way? So that kind of feeds into the first question of like, how do we write and rewrite the story? And I think it's a collaborative process. It's like one we're doing, because it's an interactive book, it's a web first. We have readers who can like log on today and see like, oh, your menu is broken. So it really comes down to working with them and writing as we get feedback and as we get reactions. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think, on the question of storytelling, it's a craft like any other, right? And it's iterative, and you don't always know. I was gonna say you don't always. You never get it right the first time around. I'm just gonna be authoritative about that. And it's many times in the same way, the same process as design. Through iterating, you sort of refine what you want the main points to be, and you inflect it, and you shape it so that it aligns with and is amplified by and sort of mutually reinforces the images. And I think for us in particular, usually what happens is, because I do all the text and I do all the historical research, like I write it, but then I give it to Tanvi and she storyboards it, like usually like lays it out in Figma, and sometimes we'll realize like, oh, visually we need a different sequence. So we need that sort of, because if you're gonna sort of layer in additional details in the same way that you saw in the slide deck, you might need to flip around the order of the narration. Or a lot of the times it happens like, Lauren, you're using too many words. Like, can't have that really, like, doesn't even fit on the screen. So like, shorten it up. But I think that's one piece. And then the thing that I'll say about how do you know that you're not having blind spots, and I like that we're ending here. I feel like this is sort of the lesson of Playfair, right? Like, there are always blind spots. There's no single view that shows you everything. And that is okay. But I think the really important thing to do, and this is something that I really try to inhabit in my practice, is adopt this approach to knowledge and understanding that really just admits that you're always sort of layering in and piecing together new information. And it's always a process, and you're always going to learn more, but the only way that you don't learn more is if you believe that you have created a thing that tells or shows you everything. So it's really important to me to say, like, knowledge is kind of learning always, and knowledge is a process. And if we can say, and again, this sort of comes back to my response earlier, if we can say, this is what our visualization is showing you, and sometimes we say, this is what our visualization is not showing you because we couldn't do everything or we chose not to do everything. But the important thing is not to reject that as an insufficient visualization, right? And be like, oh, well, someone else could have done a better job or they would have shown you more. It's to say, no, like how we all learn is by piecing together all the bits of information that we get from our experiences in the world. And we learn as we grow, we learn as we move through life. And we should actually seek out the perspectives that we don't ourselves possess or that we're not seeing, because that's what contributes to this greater sort of whole of knowledge that we presumably all want to work towards.
Thank you for listening. We are here all day, all week. So please come find us if you have more comments. And thank you for having us. I'm very happy.